The air in the press room was charged, but not in the usual, light-hearted way that follows a routine post-game interview. Under the blinding lights, the rows of cameras pointed forward like watchful sentries, every lens fixed on the woman who had quickly become the most magnetic figure in professional women's basketball. Caitlin Clark sat at the podium, posture composed, eyes steady. She was prepared to answer the standard stream of questions, analysis of her performance, reflections on strategy, maybe even a playful nod to her growing celebrity. What she didn't expect was the jolt that came next. A reporter, voice sharp and deliberately unsoftened, leaned into her microphone and delivered a line that cut through the room like a sudden drop in temperature. "You don't deserve the hype." No preamble, no context, just a pointed challenge hurled across the table. The words seemed to hang in the air, almost visible, vibrating with the weight of their implication. In that instant, the hum of side conversations evaporated. Keyboards stopped clicking. Every person present could feel that something unusual was unfolding. This was not another polite exchange between athlete and press. This was a confrontation. The remark didn't just question her talent. It took aim at the very foundation of her rise. Clark's journey to the WNBA had been a narrative of relentless work and undeniable skill, told in highlight reels and headline features. She had been painted as a generational player, someone capable of drawing crowds that rivaled long-established stars. But in those 5 words, the reporter was suggesting it was all smoke and mirrors, that the acclaim was built on image rather than substance. It wasn't curiosity, it was provocation. For a moment, the space felt suspended in time. A few journalists shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others kept their eyes locked forward, waiting for the reaction. Was this the kind of comment that would be ignored? Would it be brushed aside with a canned answer? Or would Clark engage, risking the kind of viral moment that could dominate headlines for days? The tension didn't come only from the words themselves. It came from what they represented. The statement tapped into a long-running undercurrent in sports coverage. The questioning of young female athletes at the height of their momentum. Men in the same position might be critiqued for their stats or strategy, but rarely was their legitimacy itself put on trial so publicly. Here, in front of dozens of cameras and an online audience that would soon balloon into millions, Clark was being told, without subtlety, that her success was undeserved. Her eyes shifted slightly, just enough to acknowledge the sting without revealing any hint of hesitation. Behind her, a team representative glanced toward the podium, as if ready to intervene. But Clark didn't speak immediately. She let the silence sit, an unspoken reminder that every second she waited was another second the reporter's words echoed in the minds of those present. In the back of the room, a photographer adjusted his lens, anticipating the shot that would capture the moment before the response. This was the kind of photograph that could become iconic, not because of the scoreboard, but because of the story it told. An athlete, young yet already a target, staring down the challenge to her worth. No one knew it yet, but the exchange was about to explode far beyond that press conference. In living rooms, on social media feeds, in barbershops and coffee shops across the country, people would be debating not just what was said, but what it meant. Was this a fair question? Was it a calculated attempt to unsettle her? Or was it an example of the kind of disrespect that too often shadows women's sports? Clark, still silent, adjusted her microphone slightly. The small movement carried an unspoken signal. She had heard the challenge, she understood its weight, and she was ready to answer. The conflict was no longer hypothetical. It was here, and the next words she spoke would determine how this moment would be remembered. The stillness in the room was deceptive. Beneath the surface, the atmosphere bristled with the kind of anticipation usually reserved for a game's final seconds. Every pair of eyes remained locked on the table where Caitlin Clark sat. The reporter's words lingered in the air, their sharpness refusing to fade. Even those who had been typing furiously into their laptops moments earlier now found their hands motionless, the glow of their screens waiting for the next development. The reporter did not flinch after delivering the line. Her expression was one of calculated confidence, as if she had rehearsed this moment, knowing it would provoke a reaction. The microphone in front of her seemed less like a tool for gathering information and more like a weapon deliberately aimed. Around her, a few colleagues exchanged quick glances, silent questions passing between them. Was this journalistic bravery or a breach of professional respect? Clark's breathing remained steady, her posture unchanged, yet there was an unmistakable shift in her presence. She wasn't just sitting at a podium anymore. She was at the center of a quiet battle, one fought with words instead of plays. Her gaze fixed on the reporter, not in open hostility but with a level, unyielding steadiness that suggested she had faced this kind of challenge before, though perhaps never so directly. The phrase itself, "You don't deserve the hype," had layers. It was not a question, though it had been posed as one. It didn't invite explanation. It implied a verdict. The choice of the word hype carried its own sting, suggesting that the attention surrounding her was manufactured, inflated by media buzz and fan excitement rather than grounded in tangible skill or hard-earned accomplishment. For any athlete, such a charge strikes at the core of their identity. For a player in her rookie season, it's an attack on both past achievements and future potential. Silence deepened. Cameras clicked, capturing still frames of the standoff. Somewhere near the back of the room, a cough broke the quiet before vanishing into the tension. The scene felt like a stage performance where the audience knew the next line could change everything. In living rooms and on mobile screens, this moment would later be replayed frame by frame, dissected for signs of discomfort, irritation, or defiance. The reporter leaned back slightly, as if satisfied that the provocation had landed. Yet there was also a subtle wariness in her eyes, because provoking a public figure carries risk. A poorly calculated jab can turn against the one who throws it, especially when the subject has the poise and public goodwill Clark possessed. Clark's hands rested lightly on the edge of the table, fingers relaxed. She blinked once, slowly, and then let her gaze sweep briefly across the room, taking in the faces of the other journalists, the cameras, the watching crowd. That small gesture seemed to reclaim control of the space, reminding everyone that although she had been challenged, she was still the one holding the attention. In that stretched-out pause, the weight of the moment grew heavier. It wasn't just about whether she would defend herself, it was about how she would do it. A measured, composed reply could reinforce her reputation as unshakable under pressure. A flash of anger could feed narratives about youth and inexperience. The calculation was unfolding in real time, each heartbeat a silent rehearsal of what might be said. Even before Clark opened her mouth, it was clear this moment had shifted the tone of the press conference entirely. What had begun as a post-game debrief had transformed into a public test of character, one where the scoreboard was replaced by perception, and every word mattered. The next sound in that room would be the first step in deciding who truly owned the narrative, the reporter who fired the shot, or the athlete who now had the chance to answer it. The pause ended with a single inhale, steady and deliberate, as if Caitlin Clark had measured every possible reaction and chosen the one that would leave no room for misinterpretation. She leaned slightly toward the microphone, not enough to seem aggressive, but enough to signal that her reply was intentional, anchored. Her eyes locked on the reporter with unwavering focus. There was no smile to soften her tone, no attempt to disguise her words in diplomacy. When she spoke, her voice carried an evenness that cut through the tension without raising in volume. It wasn't a retort designed to match the sting of the provocation. It was something sharper, a statement that carried the weight of truth and the confidence of someone unwilling to be defined by another's assessment. Each sentence fell with precision, as if she were setting down undeniable facts one by one, the kind that could not be unraveled by follow-up questions or speculative commentary. Her first words addressed the heart of the accusation without repeating it. She spoke of the hours before sunrise, the unrelenting drills, the seasons played through injury and exhaustion. She described the expectations she had carried since college, how each stage of her career had been met with skepticism until results spoke for themselves. Her voice never trembled, but each detail she gave pressed back against the reporter's claim, stripping it of its foundation. There was no grand gesture, no need to pound the table or raise her voice. Her composure became its own form of defiance, an unspoken reminder that the loudest message is often delivered with restraint. She acknowledged that public attention could be fleeting, that hype could swell and fade, but she made it clear that her focus had never been on the noise surrounding her. It had always been on the work itself. As she spoke, the room seemed to draw closer, the quiet broken only by the faint hum of camera equipment. Journalists who had been leaning back in their chairs now sat forward, pens poised above notepads. Even the reporter who had thrown the challenge watched with a stillness that suggested she was absorbing more than just words. Clark concluded not with a defensive plea but with a calm declaration of purpose. She was here to compete, to win, to push the game forward. Recognition, she said, was not her goal. It was a byproduct of performance, and performance came from dedication. There was a finality in her tone, not confrontational but absolute, as if closing a door on the matter. When she leaned back from the microphone, the silence that followed was different from the one before her answer. This was not the brittle quiet of anticipation but the solid stillness that comes after something definitive has been said. A few nods rippled through the press rows. Cameras clicked in quick succession, as if trying to capture the precise frame where control of the moment shifted. The reporter who had delivered the provocation made no immediate move to respond. Her expression was unreadable, though there was no mistaking that the exchange had not gone as she might have imagined. Clark's answer had not only neutralized the remark, it had reframed the entire interaction, transforming it from an attack into a display of resolve. Somewhere outside that room, the footage of those few minutes was already making its way into the hands of editors, social media managers, and commentators. But inside, the air felt lighter, as if the unspoken question of who commanded the room had been decisively answered. Caitlin Clark had not simply responded. She had taken the narrative into her own hands, and she was not letting go. The press conference ended, but the moment refused to stay confined within those walls. Even before Caitlin Clark stepped away from the podium, phones were buzzing, notifications lighting up with clips that had already escaped into the digital bloodstream. By the time she reached the hallway outside, her answer was looping on social media feeds, the words transcribed in bold headlines, the video dissected frame by frame. What had been an exchange between two people in a crowded room was now a spectacle drawing millions of eyes. Sports networks cut into regular coverage to replay the segment, analysts slowing it down, pausing to comment on the steadiness of Clark's gaze, the precision of her language, the absence of defensive bluster. Talk radio hosts replayed the audio, alternating between praise for her composure and debate over whether the reporter's question was a legitimate challenge or a calculated provocation. Each replay seemed to deepen the divide. Those who admired her saw in that moment the qualities of a champion, while those skeptical of her rise framed it as evidence that scrutiny was part of the territory she had chosen. In the echo chamber of the internet, the incident became more than a basketball story. Fans posted side-by-side clips of her response alongside moments from her college career, creating a narrative of consistency, an athlete who had always met pressure head-on. Hashtags surged, some celebrating her resilience, others mocking the reporter's failed attempt to unsettle her. Memes appeared within hours, turning the phrase, "You don't deserve the hype," into an ironic badge of honor that supporters wore like a rallying cry. But outside the fever of online reaction, a quieter ripple spread through the sports media industry itself. Journalists began weighing in, some defending the role of tough questioning as part of the profession, others warning that personal challenges disguised as inquiries eroded trust between athletes and reporters. The debate wasn't limited to Clark. It touched on the broader treatment of female athletes, who often faced a level of scrutiny that questioned not just performance, but legitimacy. Clark's teammates, when asked, tread carefully in their responses. Some smiled and said they weren't surprised by how she handled it, while others hinted that the exchange had reinforced their respect for her leadership. Privately, a few admitted they found the moment satisfying. Proof that even under fire, their point guard could control the floor, whether it was hardwood or a press room. Meanwhile, the reporter at the center of it all found herself under a spotlight she hadn't anticipated. Her social media accounts were flooded with both support and criticism, each side convinced they understood her intentions. In some circles, she was praised for not shying away from a pointed question. In others, she was accused of stepping outside the boundaries of professional conduct. The The dual narrative ensured that the story had no single owner. It was being shaped and reshaped in real time by those consuming it. By the end of the day, the clip had been shared by prominent athletes from other sports, each adding their own interpretation. Some called Clark's response a masterclass in handling pressure. Others noted that moments like these could define how a young athlete is perceived for years to come, not because of the question itself, but because of how she answered. The footage wasn't just living on highlight reels. It was becoming part of her personal mythology, a reference point for future discussions about her career and character. In arenas across the country, as other games played out, the moment was being discussed in locker rooms, media rooms, and commentary booths. It had transcended its original setting, turning into a conversation about professionalism, resilience, and the evolving relationship between athletes and the press. What began as a few tense seconds between two people had unfolded into a sprawling, multi-voice story, one that showed no sign of fading as the next game day approached. In the days that followed, the scene at that press conference was no longer just a sports moment. It had become a cultural flashpoint. Conversations that began in comment sections spilled into op-eds, talk shows, and panel discussions. The focus shifted from Caitlin Clark's individual response to the larger question it raised. Where should the line be drawn between rigorous journalism and personal provocation? The simplicity of the exchange, a single sharp statement, a composed answer, made it a perfect canvas for conflicting interpretations. For many observers, the incident underscored a persistent imbalance in the way female athletes are covered. They argued that while tough questions are a staple of competitive sports, the framing often changes when the subject is a woman at the peak of her rise. Athletic performance is measured alongside, and sometimes beneath, commentary on personality, marketability, and whether public enthusiasm is earned. Clark's encounter with the reporter became an example in these arguments, cited in think pieces about how scrutiny in women's sports sometimes strays from objective analysis into territory that questions an athlete's very right to the spotlight. Inside professional circles, the discussion took on a more introspective tone. Journalists debated how to maintain the integrity of their craft while recognizing the human dynamics of high-pressure moments. Some maintained that challenging questions are necessary to cut through rehearsed soundbites and expose a person's real character. Others countered that framing a question as a verdict leaves little room for honest dialogue and risks eroding trust between the press and those they cover. The Clark incident became a case study in training sessions for young reporters, dissected as both a cautionary tale and a reminder of the impact a single sentence can have. The WNBA community, meanwhile, seized on the moment to highlight the evolving relationship between its players and the media. Veteran athletes voiced their own experiences of being doubted or dismissed, drawing parallels to Clark's situation. The Players Association released statements emphasizing the importance of respect in press interactions, not as a shield from criticism, but as a standard for professionalism. In their view, respect did not dilute accountability, it elevated it. For Clark herself, the storm seemed to leave her unshaken. Publicly, she addressed it only briefly, reiterating that her focus remained on the game, her team, and the goals ahead. But in the minds of fans and commentators, the image of her steady gaze and measured words had already taken root as part of her identity. It became a shorthand for resilience, the kind of moment that gets replayed in tribute videos years later, set against the arc of a career. What lingered most was not the exact phrasing of her answer, but the way she had delivered it. She had faced a direct challenge to her legitimacy in front of cameras broadcasting to millions, and she had turned it into an opportunity to define herself on her own terms. That shift from defending to defining was what resonated far beyond basketball. It was the reason the clip continued to circulate long after the initial headlines had faded. In the end, the incident did more than settle a brief exchange between athlete and reporter. It exposed fault lines in sports media, illuminated the double standards still at play, and reminded audiences that the court is not the only place where a player's composure is tested. For Caitlin Clark, it was a moment that could have unsettled her footing. Instead, it became a defining scene in her early career, a reminder to everyone watching that hype may fade, narratives may shift, but character, once revealed under pressure, tends to endure.